Please join me in welcoming Marcelle Polednik and Idris Khan.
Thank you all for coming. This is really an amazing crowd. So thank you for turning out. Thank you to all of our out-of-town guests who are here for the opening festivities for the exhibition. Yes, let's give them a round of applause. So tonight we have the distinct pleasure of talking about your work. And what we thought we would do is really follow the arc of the exhibition. And just by a show of hands, just that'll help guide our discussion, how many people have had a chance to see the show yet? Wow, you guys are good. Okay, this is fantastic. Good. So we'll go room by room and really pick an object or two from each section of the exhibition. And then we've also enhanced the presentation with some additional images and other projects that we think are really important to discuss in relation to Idris's career. So just a little bit of background to say, we started working on this exhibition. It depends how you start counting. Idris started working on this exhibition in 2004. Yeah, that's true. Right? That's true. When he opened his thesis exhibition at the Royal College of Art. And the first set of works that are in our project here in Milwaukee were also part of that exhibition. So in a sense, we're tracing a 20-year trajectory that began almost 20 years ago to the day, which is really exciting. In reality, yes, another round of applause. I love the enthusiasm. And then you could also say we started working on this exhibition 12 years ago, which is the time of the slow exhibition that Liz mentioned, and when I first included Idris in a project that I curated. But in effect, we started the work in earnest in about 2019. Idris came to the Milwaukee Art Museum at the beginning of 2020, the last artist to visit the museum before we shut down for the pandemic. And even though the project was delayed by 2 years as a result of the pandemic, I'm so glad, because the last 3 of the rooms in the exhibition would not have come to pass. They're made up of works that would not have been ready yet. And so the entire exhibition is changed by virtue of those last 3 rooms. Yeah. So Idris, would you like to say anything in opening before we delve in?
No. Let's talk about the work.
Then let's start at the beginning.
Okay, here we are. So this is a photograph called, you can all read it there, Every Photograph Taken Whilst Traveling Around Europe in the Summer of 2002. And this was the first layered photograph I made when I started at the Royal College. It's an amazing place, the master's there, and very small. At the time it was very small, not many students, 15 per year. And when I first got to London, I sort of froze. I did a bachelor's in photography at Derby University, and then I got into the master's at the Royal College, came down to London. And London, for me, was obviously the busiest city I've ever lived in. And I felt like I was surrounded by images all the time, everywhere, on tubes, on buses. It's images, images, images. And it was right at the rise of digital photography as well. So I would say that the photography increased its magnitude by at least 10 times the amount of images in the world. And I froze, and I didn't make any pictures at all for the first year that I was there. Read a lot, listening to the peers and what they had to say, and trying to absorb everything. And then I got to the point of, okay, I quite like the idea of recycling pictures, meaning that I don't want to add many more images into the world. How can I look back at a period of time and collapse those images into one thing? So a generic photograph, if you like. So then I said, well, okay, I just went on this huge trip to traveling around Europe before I started, and I had all of these images. I think this is made up of around about 400 pictures. But it's almost encapsulating that entire period of time. We all take so many pictures when we're on holiday or traveling or wherever we are, and we have them in albums, and not so many anymore in terms of albums. To be honest, not many people print pictures. So it's this idea then of collapsing time, that moment, into one image, and just to have the one instead of having many.
There are a couple things I would add to that. One of which is, just a little refresher, because we're all so used to photography now. We all walk around with our phones and we take 1 million pictures a day. And one of the things that we're doing every time we take that picture is we're isolating a specific moment from the flow of time, right? We're saying this, not that, or that. And one of the beautiful things about Idris's work, especially these early photographic works, is that they release photography into the flow of time. They recombine time in a single photographic image, which is unusual and poetic and starts to free photography up from just being a record, if you will, to being something that's more related to how time actually works. The second thing, which you talked about a little bit this morning when we had our press preview, was the importance of surface and how the structure of the images you made were in part in response to the photographic surface. So can you say a little bit more about that?
I think there's a level of frustration with the photographic surface in some way, and probably I really wanted to be a painter, but I wasn't that talented at the time, and it was photography that gave me the access to make images and bring my ideas to fruition. But you're dealing with a flat surface in photography, and I was always frustrated by the fact that what you do is you look through a picture in some way. You look at the person in that picture, or where that picture is, the memory of that. You're not actually looking at the paper, the physicality of that. So in some way, I wanted to bring images to the front, make it look like I'd painted them. There was obviously this deception with the viewer. Should we go to the next slide?
Let's do it.
A deception with the viewer to think, well, is it a charcoal drawing? Is it a photograph? Is it a pencil drawing? So then that's the intrigue. Then you go up to it closer, you know, okay, this is a photographic surface. So I've always liked that, and I've always played with that sort of deception.
Yeah, and of course, when, again, as Idris mentioned, the idea of photography, and Roland Barthes, the great critic, said it very well when he said photography is a light, transparent envelope. It is not what we see when we look at photographic images. We do look through the photograph into the image. And with these photographs, such as this beautiful example from the Berndt and Hilla Becher triptych, the first images that you see when you walk into the exhibition, really calls attention to the surface of the photograph and the photograph as an object and as a fabrication, not as unmediated reality, but as something that artists create. And that's a very important concept that we see as a through line in Idris's work all the way to the most recent body of work. We'll get back to that at the end of our talk.
Yeah, and this is sort of starting. So the Beckers were obviously typologists, right? So they liked photographing the same thing many, many, many times over and over again. And when I did this, it was very much about showing the differences between those pictures. So actually what becomes most apparent is the differences. And then, of course, this particular one starts to look like it's hovering. It's just like this spherical sphere hovering off the ground, something like it's been dropped from space or something like that. It has a different feeling. Then there's the other one, which has a lot more energy. You almost look like it's sort of spinning, and then the house looks like it's shaking. So it's just giving for me, a different feel to what was a very stark photographic documentation of certain buildings.
Absolutely, and reanimating the forms that are rendered so still in the original photographs. I love this one. It's such a great story. Can you tell us the story?
Yes. So being in London, going to the Tate, and this was a very popular show, and there were huge lines to go and see this exhibition. And it was back in the day when I didn't know anyone at the Tate, so I couldn't get in. So I was like, oh, I can't really be bothered to queue so long. And I thought to myself, well, everyone has a Turner in their mind, or the memory of a Turner. And so I went to the shop, and for some reason I think there were over 75 or 80 postcards from the exhibition. So I bought all the postcards and relived the exhibition through the postcards. And then I thought to myself, well, actually, can I make a generic Turner? So then I photographed every single postcard and then layered them on top of each other, and that's what you're looking at now. And of course, you can't get away from the fact that it is a Turner. And you still have the sludgy browns, and you have the skyline, and so much drama in the image as well. But I just love the fact that I experienced the exhibition through reproduction.
One of my favorite stories from this show. But I would also say, I think of it not as a generic Turner, but rather as the compilation of all of the very specificities of Turner. And what that does, in a sense, is it shows you, it sort of lays bare some of Turner's devices when he's thinking about landscape, right? You always have this beautiful horizon line. You have this beautiful, murky, grayish blue sky, and this luminescence in the landscape. And all of those very quintessential Turner characteristics come through when you layer them on top of one another. So I think it's the essential version of Turner.
And it's important at this point, actually, that you see that I'm not trying to take everything to blackness. So when I'm photographing on multiple exposures and then scanning and layering and doing some Photoshop, it's not about the process, essentially, to eradicate completely. I want to keep or hold on to some of the beauty of that picture. So there is a process there, but actually holding on to that first trigger of beauty is very important to me.
Yeah, good point. So one of the things that may or may not be clear, but is important, is that, as you can see, Idris seldom photographed in the early 2000s from the original. He was already working from a reproduction to start, whether it's the postcards in this case, or in the case of the Beschers, for example, reproductions of the photographs that were in books. And ultimately, he turned to books themselves as a source of inspiration.
Yes, and this is every page of the Quran. I grew up in an Islamic household. My father was from Pakistan, and he came over to the UK when he was in his early 20s to finish studying medicine. He married a Welsh woman and had 4 kids, and I was one of them. You know, it was very much, he wanted us to become Muslims in practice. And of course, again, there was a sort of knock-on and a rebellious stage. My brother stopped practicing, and then I ended up not practicing either. But we were taught to read the Quran, and the way you read the Quran is not like a normal book from page 1 to the end. You read and you repeat pages after pages after pages of the same page. Usually a page per week, so it really embeds into your head. So in some way, I look at this image and think about, at the time, questioning perhaps that early influence in my life could have influenced why I make the work that I do today. Through repetition, through accumulation. It's a very repetitive religion, praying 5 times a day, returning to the same prayer mat. So there's this, in some way, this subconscious that could, you know, maybe lead into why I make the work I do. So I questioned it, and then I made an image about it. So I scanned every single page of the book and layered them on top of each other. And what I quite like is there's the reference here to almost the back plate of a camera, of a 5x4 camera. It almost frames the world. It's inviting you to go into a different world, this window into a different world. And of course, when you scan a book like that, you have this beautiful gutter in the center. It almost feels like you're going to fall into that. You're falling into its power. Before I showed this, which if you don't mind me saying, before I showed this piece, I got a lot of people's opinions, because this wasn't set out to be a political gesture. It's not. It was to look at my heritage, to look at a very beautiful thing, and to make it a photographic picture of it. It wasn't sacrilegious in any way. I took it to a lot of mosques and asked people there whether they felt it was offensive, and they didn't think so. You know, they felt that it was a very beautiful thing of something that's very important in their lives. And of course, then for me, it's I suppose, captured a chapter in my life. So, and yeah, it was a nod to perhaps the practice that I do now.
Well said. Nothing to add. So you might say that in some ways, the Quran was an homage to your father too, and to your upbringing, and the influence of music, which becomes one of 2 or 3 great protagonists in Idris's work, is a tribute to your mother.
Yes. So my mother was a pianist. She loved playing the piano. I think at the time, and not knowing necessarily, I think she had a few mental health issues, but she seemed to be happiest at the piano. And she had a little music room where I suppose it was my first sort of memory of in some way high art. I never grew up around art necessarily. The walls were definitely bare in my house, but that was the sort of engagement into sort of a memory of her with music all over the floor and playing the piano and sitting there. But then if you look at the actual work that I actually chose to make, I mean, again, this was I think a moment where maybe the early photographs weren't doing as much for my hand as these are. So using musical notation in this way, I could really start to see my hand. The notes became these fluid marks on the surface. And this was really when I thought, well, you know what, this actually does look like a painting. Could look like a Pollock, could look like an abstract image. And I always choose pieces of music that have a story. This is a piece by Olivier Messiaen, and it's called Quartet for the End of Time, La Fin du Temps. And he made this in a concentration camp, I think in 1942. And I imagined him in that room, cell, whatever you want to call it. And it was a piece made of the bird songs that he was hearing outside. And he created this piece of music. And for me, it almost felt like maybe he didn't have any paper. Maybe he scratched onto the surface of the wall. But I wanted that energy. I wanted that energy of capturing that particular piece of music in this image.
Yeah, it's a beautiful work. And it's amazing to see there are multiple works that feature sheet music in what we lovingly call the music room of the exhibition. And each one has such a different energy about it. So by contrast, if we look at this work, for example,
yeah,
it has a completely different structure visually and also auditorily.
And this was made, I think this was made before. Did I make this before? Yeah, I made this before with Messiaen.
Yeah.
And just a little side note there, I married an artist called Annie Morris, and she is Jewish. And that story of that time of that piece came about moving into sculpture as well. I actually made a sculpture of that particular work because I wanted to see what it would like to embed the musical notation into the surface of steel. So that really influenced both those works. This is one of my favorite works, Beethoven Sonatas. And again, there's a story there because I imagined Beethoven when he made these works, because he was losing his hearing at the time, putting his head on the piano, trying to listen to the notes as he played them. And what was strange about when I made this particular work is that it looked like the notes were really dark. Mm-hmm. So that as a viewer, you're also having that physical relationship with the surface. You wanted to go closer, you need to see the notes. And I thought that was a really nice story, the engagement, and that's why I kept it quite black in this particular one.
Yeah. It's wonderful to see the difference, and in a sense, the music contained within the visual structure of looking at it in this way. We're going to transition to a short clip of the 3-channel video installation, which is in the room directly after the music room. So before we do that, Idris, maybe you could introduce the work.
Yeah, I mean, again, a sort of an experiment at the time of trying to make what I'm doing in the photographs and then thinking about a film. So this was a pianist called Warren Maley Smith. We became friends. I said, oh, let's make a film together. And I love Schubert's piano sonatas because it was the last piece that he made before he passed away. And I imagined him, and the story is quite vivid, that he was not in front of the piano when he wrote this work. He was visualizing it from his deathbed. And so therefore I had that image in my head thinking, well, can I visualize it in film in the way that he perhaps saw it as he made it? It's a triple screen score. I used 16mm film, and I rewound the film back on itself and re-recorded, and then rewound and re-recorded. So you had this multi-layered image in the end. I managed in the editing then to bring it back so it wasn't complete cacophony. Because I think actually when you look at some of the photographs, it really does feel like you're seeing everything in an instant, all those sounds and all those images, if you like. And so for this, it's a visual manifestation of that idea.
Let's have a little look. was a dramatic moment, but beautiful.
So you actually get quite mesmerized, even though there's this sort of awkwardness to the sound. And what I was quite interested in was that as the performer would come to the piano, it was his natural timing that was not exact each time. So I quite like the fact that there's little moments, there's differences in every time he comes to the piano is slightly different, slightly off, the beat's slightly off, and then that creates those wonderful moments of repetition and sound.
Exactly, because the score remains the same, and the differences are based on the human being who's playing that music. And so there's a beautiful, very haunting nature, I think, in the way that we see, multiple hands going down the piano just a couple of seconds apart. It's one of the first works that I saw by Idris. It was really compelling from my perspective. And the other thing I've learned subsequently about these works by Schubert is that he too was, in a sense, creating a typology. He wanted to capture all of human experience in these last works. And so even that idea of all of everything, which is something that you've repeatedly set out to do as you were thinking about typologies, was so well suited for a work by you. So there's a couple of moments in the exhibition where you come out of one room and go into the other, and you probably wonder, am I still in the same show? And we're about to go through one of those moments. And so we'll talk about the continuities and the differences.
Yes, so in the studio, which is nice, I thought I'd show you a little clip of me making the oil stick photographs and also the chalkboard photographs, which we'll see in the next slide. So it's a nice little glimpse into how I made these works. I had a painting set up, and I would come in every day and write certain words and then photograph that process. So what you're seeing, actually go to the next slide, I think. This is the others. So this is the chalkboard series. And I guess what I was interested in this was that I was influenced by Cy Twombly's work quite a lot in his chalkboard series. But it wasn't actually the paintings that I love the paintings, but it was actually the photographs of his studio at the time. He loved photographing his studio and everything that was in the studio, all of the paintings that he had resting up against the walls. And I saw this really nice photograph of all his paintings resting up against each other, and I kind of loved that. It was almost like, the time was on top of time, or the painting was on the top of the painting, and it was kind of an interesting idea. So I always think that my work is about trace, memory, and loss, and the chalkboard made the perfect tool to make these types of work. So that's me in front of the board with the camera. I'd make a mark, I'd photograph that mark, I'd remove that mark, and then that process every day changes. And they end up with sort of over 2,000 photographs. And if you look at Over and Over, which is the next one, this is that. So it's not that I would do that whole entire line and photograph that line. I would photograph pieces of the word and link them together. And you get a sense of the mark, the removal of that mark, and then we start again. And then it's nice because a painting necessarily can't do that. When you're working with a camera, you're working with transparency, you're working with time, it's very evident that that's what's happening, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that I think about in relation to these works is actually going back to photography. So if you think about the analog photographic process, the image itself is made of silver particles that rest on the surface of a piece of paper. And then they get coated and they get fixed so that they stay in place. But it's all made of these little tiny granules at a microscopic level. And the chalkboard is a really interesting counterpoint that has a lot in common with photography, because even after you erase the marks, the chalk that actually created the marks is still there. It doesn't go away. And so the accretion of all of those moments, even after you've erased what they mean or how they look, is still a residue that creates the surface for the next set of marks that you make. So there's a beautiful sense of imprinting words, imprinting ideas. They never go away. They're always there. Everything you do is haunted by the surface that you've created in the past. And that's a really beautiful idea. And these works also, we should mention, you've seen the show so you know, they're quite dramatic in scale. And that makes them even more arresting, I think, and monumental.
And the next slide, which is the 4 minutes and 33 seconds, obviously it's an appropriation of the John Cage work, which is about silence. If you don't know that work, he made it so that he had an orchestra on stage, and as the they started to play, they just held. And they were silent for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And I thought, well, how can I visualize silence? So I wrote 4 minutes and 33 seconds over and over and over again, and then made the image that you see in front of you now. And one note about the actual room, which Marcelle curated so beautifully, was that it felt like you were in a studio in that room. I quite like it. It's almost like you have all of these images around you, and you can imagine an artist going from one painting to the next and making the next. You were really surrounded by those pictures, which I really loved.
Yeah, they're very harmonious together. This is another work that's also in that room that you just described, but it is a really beautiful segue to the next room, in a sense.
Yeah, so this is a photograph called Grey Bucket. And, you know, I will never talk about being political, but everyone gets influenced by the media and what they're looking at. And at the time, I was looking at images of war. There was a lot of things coming out of Syria at the time. And I saw a man who lost everything. He had buildings around him that were completely crumbled, and he was sitting on this bucket. And it just stayed with me. So I started to write poems about these images that I was seeing. And that poem then became an image on painting, and then I would photograph the painting. So again, it's sort of capturing that moment, writing about certain things that influence you, and then go on to make an image.
And it's interesting that you bring up writing, because that's certainly where we end up going in the next room. But it's wonderful to note that writing for you started to introduce a different kind of mark making. And sometimes that meant mark making by the hand, even though Idris wasn't creating painterly surfaces yet. And other times you introduced devices to be able to translate your writing into other bodies of work. And that brings us to this beautiful black painting.
So this was a series that I started to use actual stamps. My wife and I had a very difficult year. I lost my mother at the age of 59, and we lost our first child through stillbirth. And thank you. And I dealt with grief in a very different way to Annie. She came in and started making these amazing, colorful sculptures about losing the shape that she'd lost. And she went that way. I started writing, so then I would write these passages of writing, maybe, I don't know, maybe 40 to 50 sentences each, and trying to rid myself of the grief of that time. And then I had all of this text, and I thought, what can I do with this text? And so I decided to make stamps. And so I made all these little rubber stamps, and I would come in and start to draw with them. And it's very cathartic. It's very repetitive. It's ink, stamp, ink, stamp, ink, stamp. And I started to create these radial formations, which you see in this painting here. And what I quite like about that formation is that you can read the end of the sentence and you can read the start of the sentence. And you don't know what's in the center. So I found that a really engaging thing for the viewer. They could bring their own baggage to the painting, essentially. You know, you see a sort of glimpse of a word, and that word can then take you anywhere you want to go. So it's not really about what I'm writing anymore. It's left there. It becomes an abstract painting. In that abstraction, you can find your own voice. So that's what became the most intriguing part of that sort of painting.
And ultimately, of course,
And it's when I started using gesso and ground.
Exactly. And ultimately, you also found a new surface to think about, and that surface is glass.
After all of this compression of time, I thought I better open it up, because there's a lot on top of each other. So I thought glass and transparency was a really lovely way of doing that. But of course, as soon as you do that opening up of this language, you're actually adding more layers to the surface through light, through shadow. This is the studio shot of me making the paintings at the time. And then if you go to the next, and then I created this, which is called Overture. The text in this is quite important. It was a show about, at the Sean Kelly Gallery in New York, it was about displacement of people, refugees, and text and first-hand interviews with them. And I thought it was kind of interesting that obviously you're separated from the country that you started in, or you had to flee at that time, and the speed that you had to flee. And there was something kind of beautiful about these words hovering in the center of this sculpture. And it was kind of, I suppose, for me, like as a sculptural process, it was so interesting to see how you created this cloud this cloud that sort of floats, and it was the only way I could almost translate that idea into a physical thing.
You know, I think that's very beautifully said. The only thing I would add here is that, of course, glass is normally a very transparent surface. And so one of the things that I love about your work, and it's been present since the beginning and continues to be present in a way, is the way that the addition of meaning actually obscures the surface. And causes you to pay attention to the surface in a different way. So the more words are applied to the surface of glass, the more meaning that piece of glass contains, the harder it is to read and the more opaque it becomes. And that oscillation between legibility and opacity is something that returns over and over again in Idris's work.
Great.
This is a work that's not in the show.
It's a little bit big. It's 23 meters high by 110 meters long. And at the same time of making that sculpture and working with an engineer in London, I got offered to make a proposal to create a monument, a national monument for the country of Abu Dhabi and the UAE. And I won. And it was just exciting to do a very monumental piece. And it was a difficult thing. Never made a public sculpture before, and especially I stood here and I looked at this huge mosque, and it was just a green field, what you're seeing. And they said, come up with an idea. And I did. And once I'd won the piece, they said, oh, we'd like it in 8 months. So we fully landscaped a 55,000 square meter piece of land with a sculpture, with a reflecting pool, and I also got asked to make a pavilion space. But I suppose what I want to why I'm showing you this is that, you know, here I am in my little studio making these works, but then, oh my God, look what can I do if I actually give them space and quite a lot of money to create this huge sculpture. It's made with 900 aluminium panels, free poured over the entire surface, steel. And what I wanted to do was, it was a piece that I wanted to almost make about loss. So when we lose people in our lives, I always think about I wanted this sculpture to be about how you don't actually ever want to fall. So the piece itself is all about leaning or pushing forward. Mm-hmm. And what you want around at that time, you want your family to support you and not let you fall. So it's made up of, how many tablets I actually did in the end? I think it was about 36 tablets. But they don't ever feel like they're falling. If you go to the next slide, you can go inside the sculpture as well. And I suppose it was very much about light and shadow too. You experience the physicality of these huge structures, but then you had this intimacy as well. So yeah, and then there was transcriptions on the actual pieces itself. It's quite beautiful from the back. Actually, it looks like a cubist painting, I think, somehow. Thank you. And then, you know, it's there, and hopefully for a very, very long time, it's a permanent piece that you can go and see. And then I got asked to make a pavilion space, and I took all these tablets and I made a roof out of them. So then as you go inside, it's the soldiers' names that they lost in battle, but then also in the center there's a glass sculpture. And then each time someone loses their life, a light is put on. So yeah, and that then leads me to the sculpture that I then made, a smaller version, but back to a gallery space, called Absorbing Light, which was a show about, about a difficult time. And I wanted to almost hold words inside bronze.
What's interesting too is that this work is also a landscape in a sense. When you're thinking about sculpture, you're always situating sculpture in a place, whether it's gallery-sized or whether it's monumental, as it was in the Abu Dhabi installation. As part of this gallery, we also have a suite of these 6 white window photographs, which are very intriguing to look at, because on the one hand, from a distance, they look like abstract expressionist gestural paintings, but they're not, are they?
No, they're windows of boarded up shops in London. I think you guys do that here as well. You know, when you go in with emulsion and you try and stop people from looking in. And I was always fascinated by that. You know, I mean, my kids will tell you that I used to just drive around London and just stop, pull over, and then take a quick snap of all these windows.
Affirmed by the child in the front row.
So I'd jump out and I'd take a picture of these marks on a window, and then I'd start to layer them, play with them. And it's quite nice because I feel like the painter of these necessarily they don't think they're making an abstract painting, but they're so free in those marks. They're so much free, they're like, oh, just get it done, let's board it up, you know, let's get it done. But actually they're kind of beautiful, and capturing that beauty is kind of a nice thing.
And so if you can imagine the installation in the museum in your mind's eye, one of the things that we try very hard to do, and I think our chief exhibition designer, David Russick, did so beautifully, is to create all of these vistas from one gallery to the next. So when you're standing and looking at Overture, which is also a piece on glass, you can look over and see these white windows, which are also glass in a sense. They're about glass. And they're also about opacity versus transparency, but a very different kind of surface, and of course a different process ultimately. But still, there is that echo and reverberation from one gallery to the next. But everything we've looked at thus far has been monochromatic, black and white, until enter blue.
Blue room. And I think what's so nice about that room as well is that it's intimate with really big paintings. So you really feel the color as you go in. So you're in this blue world. And of course, that step into blue is another thing I always talk about, confidence, going into a color. That step into blue is not so far away from black and white. You know, it still triggers for me the same sort of emotions it does. And the paintings and the colors, the color blue that I chose is 50% Prussian blue, 50% ultramarine blue, marble dust, slate dust, black pigment in the mix. And I find it's a color that it's neither night or day, somehow. You're sort of caught in between, and that's kind of a nice feeling, I think.
Yeah.
It's a gesso panel, aluminium gesso, sanded back, and then I stamp onto the surface. And what's beautiful about gesso is that the oil is almost held in the surface, rather than feel like it being on top. And I feel like it's sort of like, held there and kept.
That makes sense. So right now
this is a photograph, sorry.
We're looking, it's very hard to see for
It's a
us.
photograph called Lost Happiness.
Lost Happiness, which is a beautiful photograph. And I think one of the things, so you talk about the color in terms of diurnal structures, right? Neither night, neither day. But also when we think about blue from an emotional perspective, it has tremendous resonance on both sides of the spectrum. We think about it as a color associated with sadness, but then we also think about it as a color associated with the sky and hope. And that to me is also a wonderful way of thinking about these works. In a sense, you're actively asking your audience to participate in the making of the meaning of this color when they stand before the work. To my eye also, whether it's in the photographs or whether it's in the paintings, this is a color that really begs closer looking in your work, because you're also treating the surface differently. You talked about the gesso, but you're also introducing a different component here. This is the first body of paintings in which we see surfaces covered with stamped words. And so to my mind, the beauty of these works is they have a strong affiliation and tie to abstract expressionism. You can think about Mark Rothko and his squares, Josef Albers. There are many, many different moments in the history of 20th century painting when artists have turned to this kind of geometric abstract structure. But as you get closer to them, you realize that the darker rectangles are all comprised of densely stamped words.
Yeah, and thinking about the composition of these works as well, if you remember the room where I had the rhythms, the black rhythms where I eradicated or painted over the actual bars of music, and what was left was just the line in between the bars, and that gave the rhythm to the piece. I took that structure and then, so these are actually pages of music that have then been changed into the actual compositions. And in a show in London, I think I had 8 paintings in a room. So you really saw this line change throughout each work. So they became almost, so there's that relationship to music again within the structure of the actual work.
Yeah, good point. There are also 2 wonderful sculptures in the same room, and they have a strong relationship to one another and also to photography and the passage of time.
Yeah, this piece is called My Mother. And this is very much about, again, time and holding on to something, if you like. Again, I mentioned earlier about this frustration or the actual fact that we don't print as many pictures as maybe we once did. And so I was interested in the physicality of paper and a photograph. And at the time, I looked at my phone and I had 65,000 photographs on it. And I was thinking, oh my God, how can you create a work that shows the volume of that time or that passage of time? Maybe over 5 years, I made 65,000 pictures. And so I did. I made a sculpture in London, which you'll go on to see. There's the maquette, and then the next one is the sculpture. So this is a 9-meter sculpture in London. It's a permanent piece near the South Bank. And that's what it is. It's 65,000 pieces of paper mounted on top of each other. The structure of that work is quite beautiful because I did it on the footprint of a 6x4 photograph. And then as it changes, it goes to a 10x8, 12x16, 16x20, as it goes up. So it was almost like, when you go into a Snappy Snaps, we call it, or whatever, print, CVS, and you go and get your photographs and you choose your scale of picture. I thought that was a nice reference to the standardization of photographic printing in some way. And so if you go back to my mother, then that is, I only found roughly 340 photographs of her existence. So from her life, which was an entire 59 years, that's what she had, to my life now in over 5 years, 65,000 pictures.
Whoops.
So that really shows what's happening in photography and how I pretty much have a photograph of my kid every single day of their life right now.
Let's take one now.
So then that is there and showing that volume of time and space.
Yeah, beautifully said. So I mentioned the fact that originally this exhibition was slated for 2 years earlier, and we're about to, in a sense, go into the first set of works which were made at a point that would have been after our exhibition if it had opened earlier. And so you see what I mean when I say the show would have been entirely different. The Season's Turn represents also an enormous watershed moment in your career for many reasons, but it also marks a year that all of us consider to be unforgettable or somehow memory-less, depending on how you experienced the pandemic. So talk about why the explosion of color. How did that happen?
At moment of panic, and leaving London to go and live in Sussex, Jago, thank you, in the English countryside. We decided to get out of the city, and I found this place on Airbnb, and we ended up there, and it was owned by an artist that I didn't know. And I called her and I said, oh, you have a studio in the shed out the back, can I use it? And she was like, yeah, sure, no problem. So we were there for the majority of that year, of the first year, which was the most, obviously, just before lockdown. And I think that we all had an experience where, when you were allowed outside, when you did have that moment, that time to actually really look at the seasons change. I think I remember that most vividly, is that these colors started popping up, and they were the most vivid colors that I've ever seen, going on these long walks or, having that time to actually look. And I suppose I always needed an excuse to go into color work, and it was the perfect one, to try and mark this time in terms of the seasons and the colors changing in that seasons. So I think this piece is very much about looking and having a lot more time, which I think we all did, even though it was an extreme panic. That maybe that made you look more closer.
I agree. It's made up of 28 individual works, 7 for each season. So if you go through the installation at the museum, we start in spring, summer, fall, and then winter. And even though we don't have a detail to show you tonight, but you've been in the gallery, so you know, the structure of the works is also quite innovative and inventive and represented a departure for you from what had happened before. So let's just unpack that a little bit, Idris.
Yeah, it's a collage. So the work is the 4 seasons, Vivaldi's 4 seasons. That's the paper and the musical notations. And of course, music paper or found paper, the watercolor is treated in a different way. It treats it in a different way. So it's much more there's much more opacity within the work. You see these kind of like really beautiful brush strokes. And we started just sort of playing and having this collage element to the work, which is kind of free, I think, somehow. You have the structure, you have this landscape structure at the bottom of each work, and then the different colors. And it was such a beautiful moment bringing the colors together like that, and seeing these sort of beautiful, subtle differences within each color.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the surfaces are so intimate in a way because of those combinations and the layers of paper on top. So following the season's turn, that really, the color palette and the process really opened up a new moment in your career, I think, and we start to see several things. First of all, one of my favorite features of the newer paintings is that beautiful band on the bottom of just pure color, which is a horizon line, if you will, that keeps us tethered as the viewers to a sense of ground. And then, of course, the surface of the works themselves, the paintings, becomes much more complex as a structure. So can you talk a little bit about those subtle changes?
Using music was the first one in the center. I think you can kind of see the relationship from the seasons works, which is using this sort of window. So the collage in the center gave me the structure to think about then making the gesso paintings like this. This is all about the space that's left between the music and the words. The music, I don't think, needs to be described in some way. It doesn't really matter. It's musical notation. We all think for sound when we look at that. So you can bring any sound to that. And then the words, obviously, are my words based on philosophy or things that I've read on the outside. But it becomes this frame. It becomes this frame of sound, essentially. Yeah. But the moment where I discovered this little tiny 5 mil space around the music, so it didn't meet, was the most important thing, because it allows that square in the middle to hover and look different to the rest.
I
and
agree.
Be framed somehow.
There's that beautiful tension. If you look closely, and I would encourage you, if you didn't have a chance to do that when you first went through the show, if you look closely at the surface, particularly at what Idris just described, that very narrow sliver of a band between the musical notation and the words, there's so much wonderful tension there. And it's so delicate, but in a sense, it holds the world order in that moment. Yeah. And similarly, at the bottom, the difference between that horizontal band of color and the words that are just resting ever so slightly on the surface is just beautiful.
What's so important about that band at the bottom as well, it speaks to landscape, and the titles are usually about landscapes. But also that it positions you, so therefore you have this depth of 3 things. Without it, if you take that away with your hand, you're just left with a frame. But having it allows that space, allows the eye to sort of travel into the painting, which I think is very important.
Agreed. These are very tightly controlled and very systematic compositions. And so while Idris was making these, he also had a bit of an antidote. And these beautiful oil stick drawings that you see here, also using musical notation, sheet music, layered, but you can see him releasing his hand, and the beautiful calligraphy and the reverie of thinking about gesture and color in a much freer improvisational way is a beautiful counterpoint to the paintings we were just looking at.
And it's we have so many pages left over from the from the watercolors that have these stacks and stacks of pages of music paper, and it's just a playful way of making a sketch. Essentially, freer, coming together, bringing colors together, letting oil stick marks do a sort of have rhythm to the actual mark itself, and creating windows. So they're sort of studio drawings in some way, I think, which could then influence paintings, I hope.
Absolutely. And sheet music is also at the center of these 2 wonderful bronzes that are part of the exhibition. And there's also, one of the things that you embrace is new technology in your work. Sometimes that is very analog technology, but new to you. And other times, technological opportunities that arise as a result of advancements in the field.
Advancements to do with actually layering of the musical notation, and also trying to embed notes into a solid surface. It almost looks like they're being held in there, which I really, really like it. And then it's every layer of a particular piece of music. I think this is Mozart's Requiem. And it's just held. I feel like it's such a beautiful thing. You've got a quartet, you think about movement and sound, and then you just see these. So 3D printing helped me develop a way that I could actually layer transparent layers within a 3-dimensional way. Yeah. And so it's held and embedded there in the surface.
And there too, there's such eternity and at the same time intimacy because of the way that they rest on one another, at almost a moment in time, if you will. And you can just picture the pages falling at any given moment, but they won't.
Yeah.
Rest assured. All right, so this is the moment where I just want to say a few words about museum exhibitions and contemporary artists. And I say this with deep love and affection. Most museum exhibitions take years to put together. I talked about 12 years, or in the case of really working on this exhibition, 6 years. And then, of course, the artists continue to make work. So while we're thinking about the best ways of contextualizing the artist's work, how we can talk about the work, what should be in the show, artists will continue to make new things. And so about 2 years ago, as we were really honing and crafting the exhibition, Idris started thinking about a new body of work, which is the final body of work in this exhibition. And it was just completed a few months prior to the opening of our show. So it really stretched our improvisational muscles at the Milwaukee Art Museum, but I'm thrilled with the outcome. And so tonight we wanted to show you a few of the studio images of the work in process, and then talk a little about what it represents, because it too is an end cap to our show, but I think a departure point for the future.
Do you want to run through them?
Sure.
So that's the studio, obviously testing colors. The step really was to make a series of works based on old master paintings. And you can kind of see what I'm sort of doing here with the structure of the, can we? No, back.
Yeah, you want to go back?
Yeah, go back. And then, so you see the sort of choices and the swatches of taking the sort of most important colors of the painting for me, and then dissecting it into different palette. The intriguing thing for me was, could I hear, and the question I was asking myself at the time, could I hear the sound of the painting? So I got together with a composer, and I said, could you scan a reproduction of a painting and actually print the sound that that painting is speaking, I guess, to us? What would it be like if you stood in front of a painting and you heard the sound of that painting? So I scanned the surface of the reproduction into a program. It then reads the volume of color, space, and tone within the painting. So every time it goes over a red, it would make a note. Every time it would go over blue, it would make a note. Every time it would go over a lot of color, it would make different notes. So the actual works in the exhibition are made up of the notes that are taken from the painting. I'm eventually going to be making compositions, and we'll create an album. And hopefully then what my biggest goal is to then, when people go into a museum and they see these great works of art, they can sit in front of those paintings and hear the brush strokes, is what I want.
I can't wait.
So we're working on that. Sadly, wasn't ready for this. I have made the one Caravaggio, which is very beautiful, but then you see the compositions that are left here today.
Yeah. So let's maybe start at the beginning, because these are very complex works. So remember when we were talking about Turner landscapes at the very beginning? In a sense, we've come full circle with a difference. So the beginning point and the inspiration point of this body of work were European masterworks of historical painting. And so you see here's a great example, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the things that Idris was thinking about is how is our memory of these masterworks structured? When we think about remembering them, what do we remember? And here I'll just enter a little parentheses because I think it's important. Normally when we think about historical paintings, much like photography in a sense, we don't think about the painting itself. We think about what it represents. So if I were to ask all of you to close your eyes and think about the Mona Lisa, you would think about the woman, right? You wouldn't think about the diminutive scale of the wood panel that it's painted on and all of the other compositional elements that are in the background that actually make the painting so astounding. We don't think about those other things. We think about mostly what it represents. And so Idris was interested in really creating a memory structure of those works that was more about what they're made of. And what they're mostly made of is color.
The Caravaggio
Yes.
painting
Yes.
after his supper.
So
You think about Caravaggio, you think about the reds. I always think about reds and browns and then those colors coming together. So yeah, you see the structure, and I suppose in some way, again, with these new works, that you actually see the development of the process of layering the musical sheets and playing with them and using them as more of a compositional tool and refining that gesture.
Yeah.
And then you'll know the next one.
The next one you will know. So I was so thrilled when Idris included a masterwork from the Milwaukee Art Museum in this series. All of you, I hope, know St. Francis in His Tomb by Francisco de Zurbarán, which is one of our most iconic historical paintings in the collection. Part of the research for this project involved talking to school children who come to the museum, and I know a lot of docents in our audience who can tell you firsthand, children are frightened of this painting. Just want to be clear, there's a cloaked figure whose face we do not see. He's holding a skull. The whole painting is very dark. It's a little scary. One of the things that I'm grateful for, Idris, is that you've made it much friendlier in your interpretation. But here it is. This is the painting we all know and love. And one of the things about it that Idris was, I think, very influenced by is the immense verticality of this representation. If you go into the galleries, you know it's a very thin, narrow, and tall painting. It follows the figure of St. Francis from his bare feet all the way to the point of his hood. And so in our galleries, it looks like this.
Yeah, and you're left with that as you leave the show. I think something I've been thinking about sort of Donald Judd a little bit within this actual work itself, and the way the structure. I had to leave that space so you really get a sense when you're in front of it. It's quite a large work. That you get that sense of verticality. And I suppose the colors I've chosen aren't necessarily referencing exactly what you see, but maybe referencing a feeling from what you see and the combinations. And maybe then when you go back to it, you may see these little glimpses of yellow, these little glimpses of blue within the tone of the actual thing as well. And I think that painting feels it's a very religious painting.
Very much so.
And there's something quite still about this representation of it. In some way, sort of hovering in the space, in those colors.
Yeah, so that's your assignment, your homework assignment. The next time you're at the museum, spend some time with the Zurbarán and then go into the galleries and see Idris's work after the tomb and compare the two in your mind's eye and see what your memory does in that process. So that concludes our scripted part of the program. Idris, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I know.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.